Hello and welcome to the National D-Day Memorials Lunchbox Lecture. I am John Long, the Director of Education here at the D-Day Memorial, and joined by Maggie Hartley, who's behind the computer making all the magic happen. And looking forward to a great presentation today from our friend Amanda at the MacArthur Memorial. Before we get to that, let me tell you about some of our upcoming events. However, COVID-19 has changed a lot of the way we do things, the way every nonprofit out there is doing things, but we have remained very busy in offering excellent digital programs for people who are stuck at home. We are also open, and it's a beautiful time of year to visit as an outdoor site. You can come with far fewer restrictions than many of our friends with indoor museums. But in addition to our being open and welcoming visitors to see our site, we are also offering many virtual programs like this one today. They are archived on our Facebook and YouTube pages as well. So if you don't get to watch them live, join in later on. Our next program comes on Monday, the 9th, with a student live stream on what is a veteran, what do we mean by veterans, and an interview with one of our supporters who is a veteran, aimed at school kids, obviously, but and in preparation for Veterans Day a couple of days later. So for all of these, go to our webpage and the events calendar to find out more information. Wednesday, November 11th is, of course, Veterans Day, and we will commemorate the day with a virtual ceremony launching at 11 o'clock on the 11th on our website, on Facebook, on YouTube, much as we did with Memorial Day and with June 6th this year. In absence of being able to have a large gathering, we will pay tribute to veterans with an excellent video that will truly inspire you. So join us for that as well. If you are a veteran and you're in the area, we offer free admission to all veterans of any time period in any armed forces on Veterans Day as well. So watch our video and then come on up the hill to see the site as well. Saturday, November 14th is our virtual Scout Day. Scout Day for many years has been one of our biggest days. Again, obviously big crowds are kind of discouraged this year, so it will be online. If you are a Scout, Boy Scout, or Girl Scout, you can check out our webpage, get some information on registering for that. For the Boy Scouts, I will be teaching one of the required merit badges, Citizenship in the Nation. So again, if you're involved in scouting, check that out as well. Thursday, the 19th, our boss, April Cheek Messier, and myself will hold a book club discussion where we'll be discussing Eric Larson's excellent book, The Splendid and the Vile, about the Churchill family and Britain in the time of the Blitz. And we will be discussing it amongst ourselves, but also taking questions. And if you would like to read the book in advance, you can order a copy from our gift shop as well. And then finally, December 4th through the 6th, Friday through Sunday, will be our Flames of Memory commemoration as well, where we have luminaria scattered throughout the site, one per every man who died on D-Day, so some 4,415 luminaria. Beautiful site, especially in the evenings. That is we're going to extend our opening hours for that. Again, it's a little bit different than we've done in the past because of COVID-19, but it's still well worth the time to come up the hill and see this very inspiring holiday site and a great reminder of the costs of our freedoms. If you're interested in purchasing one of the luminaries, you can do that online on our webpage. And if you can get that done by December 1st, and do it in memory of a veteran, your father, your mother, your Uncle Frank, whatever, you can have that in the program if we get the information by December 1st. So again, all that information is on our website. And if you have any questions, feel free to give us a call or an email about all of these upcoming virtual programs. Well, today we are very thrilled to welcome Amanda Williams with the MacArthur Memorial up the road in Norfolk. For many years, they have been a partner in an organization called the Virginia World War II Heritage Alliance, a coalition of 7 World War II sites across the Commonwealth of Virginia that help to keep the history of not only what the Commonwealth did, but really how the war impacted world history. And MacArthur Memorial obviously has a great story to tell. And so Amanda is here to give us a program on winning the peace, MacArthur, and the occupation of Japan. So welcome, Amanda. It's good to see you, virtually see you. And we are very thrilled to offer these programs in conjunction with some of our partners across the state. We've had a few others as well. And I'm looking forward to this because to me, this is an important topic. MacArthur is one of those men that everyone knows their name, but not nearly enough people can tell you much about him. And his role in the war, commanding the forces in the Pacific, obviously is of great importance. Fewer people understand what he did in the peace afterwards. And so I'm looking forward to this talk because I think how the war ended and what happened afterwards is a fascinating study. So let me ask you first, how are things at the MacArthur Memorial? Are you open? Are you welcoming visitors, and how things are going?
Yeah, well, things are going pretty well here in Norfolk. We've been open since July. And obviously operating under all the different museum regulations that we're all kind of working with right now. But lots going on, lots of virtual events. And so all things considered, it's actually been a pretty nice year for the memorial this year. So
excellent. Well, we're looking forward to your talk, and I'll turn it over to you now and give.
All right. Well, thanks again for having me. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of obviously MacArthur and the occupation of Japan. And what I think is important to remember is that history really demonstrates that great battlefield victories can completely unravel or lose luster in an occupation. An occupation is something that we consider a less formal field of battle, but it's in a sense a battle itself. And again, although dismissed as the end of a conflict, an occupation can be considered also a reconfiguration of the battlefield, where you can lose a piece that you think you've won. Considering the bitter fighting that took place in the Pacific theater in World War II, I would say that in August of 1945, the occupation of Japan was a very daunting prospect. It was something that obviously the Japanese people were concerned about, but it was something that people in the American government, the Allied governments, and in the American military were really, really worried about. How was this going to go, given how nasty and ugly the war in the Pacific had been? Now, back in May of 1945, when the war ends in Europe, the Pacific War is still raging, and news of the surrender doesn't really mean much to a lot of the service members who are still fighting in the Pacific. The Pacific, again, was a very difficult place to be in terms of environment, in terms of enemy, and just in terms of the vastness of it. I think Americans really had a mental map of what Europe was. I don't think they really understood the Pacific in the same way. I think Asia in particular is very difficult for them to comprehend. If you compare oral histories of veterans who fought in Europe as compared to oral histories of veterans who fought in the Pacific, I think you get a sense of this. It was a very, very different war in the Pacific. For our purposes today, though, the story of the occupation begins in mid-August 1945 with the surrender of Japan, or at least when Japan announces that it's going to cease resistance. Surrender is kind of a difficult term to use there. As in May of 1945, news of Japan's willingness to capitulate is greeted by enthusiastic crowds all over the world, especially in these allied countries. People are elated because they think this means the war is over, the Allies have won, that's the end of it, victory is complete. And so while I said earlier that military leaders, political leaders around the world are thinking about what's next in Japan, for the most part, populations around the world, your kind of rank and file, everyday people, I think a lot of them look at the situation and think, we're glad the war's over, but nobody's really thinking about what happens to Japan next. If you're in Japan, it's a little bit of a different story for you. By August 1945, Japan had been at war since the late 1930s. Its economy was shattered, and there's a term that I'm probably going to butcher, yaki no hara, and this essentially means burned plain, and it's how a lot of the Japanese describe their country at this point. You've had 68 Japanese cities wiped off the face of the map. And again, Japan is a very small island nation. So you've had 68 cities wiped off the face of the map, 66 of those due to conventional bombing, and 2 of them due to the atomic bombs. You've had schools destroyed, hospitals destroyed, transportation, infrastructure, communications, everything. You've had farms destroyed, and you have 2 million Japanese dead, including a generation of young men. And my computer just went down. Am I still with you guys? All right, am I still with you guys? All right, we're going to assume I am.
You are still with us.
Okay, sorry about that. What happened there? All right, so you've got about 2 million Japanese people dead, including a generation of young men. You have 15 million people who are absolutely homeless, and you have people struggling to survive all over the country. In some areas, order completely breaks down. You have gangsterism, you have lawlessness, you have the Japanese being confronted by famine, by disease, and a great sense of fear. You have a country on its knees, kind of looking for hope in a lot of ways. Into this steps Douglas MacArthur, the general of the army, 5-star general. He steps into the occupation, and he finds out that he's going to be in charge of this occupation in August, pretty much the same day the Japanese announced their intention to capitulate. He's informed that he'll be running this occupation. It is a job that he had been lobbying for. It's a job that he had been laying the groundwork for since probably 1942. And it's a job that he sees as his destiny. He is Douglas MacArthur. He has a destiny. Think what you will about his flaws, about the ego and things like that, but there isn't a serious scholar today who thinks that he was the wrong choice for this particular job. But why do we consider him an inspired choice for this? Well, I'm going to take you kind of back into his history a little bit before we get into. Basically, MacArthur has decades of experience in Asia. He serves about 4 tours of duty there from the time he's commissioned in 1903 to the 1930s. His second period of service in Asia starts right around 1905, kind of towards the end of the Russo-Japanese War. And he is going to serve as an aide to his father, who is a career army officer. And they're going to travel through Asia over the course of the year. He's going to travel from Japan all the way to what today is the Khyber Pass. Then he's going to take a southern route back through most of Southeast Asia. You see the map here on the left of kind of the extent of his travels. And this is going to be a really formative experience in his life because it leads him to believe that Asia has enormous economic potential. It also gives him a very nuanced understanding of an area of the world that has billions of people in it. And by the end of the trip in 1906, he comes back to the States with a very deep sense that the colonial system is a problem and that it is going to lay seeds of future conflict in the region. So he comes out of the trip very anti-colonial, but then he's also going to leave the region with a sense that race has no bearing on anybody's capabilities. A lot of people don't realize this, but basically from about 1906 onward, Douglas MacArthur has no issue with race. This interest in kind of anti-colonialism, this, the fact of him not being a racist, these are going to be two very helpful things in a leader of this occupation in Japan. Flash forward about a decade, and we have MacArthur in World War I. He's one of the more popular battlefield commanders in the AEF, and he, at the end of the war, is absolutely devastated by the Versailles Treaty. He's deeply troubled by what he saw in the war, by the casualties, at least that, under his command during the war, and he feels that the Versailles Treaty completely betrays the sacrifices of the men who served under him. And of the Versailles Treaty, he says in 1919, it's more like a treaty of perpetual war than a treaty of perpetual peace. He knows that World War I, we won on the battlefield, but it fails off the battlefield. And so from about 1941 to 1945, he's absolutely determined that if we are going to make even greater sacrifices in World War II, those sacrifices can't be met with a failure to win the peace. And so from the start of World War II, I think as he's lobbying for this job to potentially lead a future occupation, I think he's thinking about an end game. What steps, what measures can we take during the war itself to ensure that in that future occupation, we are positioned for success? And again, I think he feels that victory on the battlefield is just part A. You've got a part B after that. All right, and another reason he's a good choice for the occupation is, of course, his sense of theater and drama. And, I think he arguably is probably the greatest actor of the 20th century. He is very often ridiculed for this. I think a lot of people in the States, especially, or anyone in the West, looks at him sometimes, and he's a little ridiculous at moments, or the ego is just so, off-putting. It's hard to take him seriously sometimes. But I think this leads us to ignore the fact that he is a master of information operations, and that is going to pay huge dividends for the Allies in the Pacific during this war, and even greater ones in the occupation that follows. I think there's moments in history when optics really, really matter, and they add something to the arsenal, and he is a master of that and adding those to our arsenal. The Pacific Theater had very, very wonderful officers in it. You look at Europe and you look at kind of the shining stars there. Well, there are very talented men as well in the Pacific Theater, but I don't think any of them, besides MacArthur, really had the ability or the desire to kind of turn in an Oscar-worthy performance in an occupation. And I think MacArthur's willingness to be that showman is an advantage in this particular point in history. And one last point. So MacArthur is this great student of history. He was a bibliophile. We've got his library here in Norfolk, and it is just full of history and lots of military history. As he gets ready to take charge of the occupation, he tells his staff that basically the odds are against them, that history proves that basically victories unravel in occupations. He knows that the great captains of military history, when you look at Alexander, Napoleon, Wellington, Kitchener, these people he sees as his peers in a very interesting way. He says they have never been able to do it. No one has ever been able to run an occupation successfully in his mind. And so, all of these great captains have seen their victories and strengths kind of dry up in prolonged occupations. But MacArthur believes he has the solution to that. This occupation will be a great challenge, but he is really invigorated by this idea that he might be able to do something that these other great captains have not been able to do. I think it can be weird to think of MacArthur in the peer group with these four men, but I think it again masks the fact that he studied the problem, he's discovered a pattern, he formulates a plan to deal with the problem, and then he's very determined to try to break the mold, break out of the box, and be successful where other people have failed. He goes into the occupation with a short list of must-haves. He says that the Japanese from the start have to think of him personally as invincible. They have to think of him as all powerful, and they have to think of him as legitimate. He believes that those three things will start the occupation off on the right foot, and they will ensure the cooperation and the agency of the Japanese people in the occupation. Once that's achieved, he believes he can run a very pragmatic, very culturally sensitive occupation. So let me talk to you about how he's going to prove to the Japanese in the early stages of the occupation that he's invincible. Now, days before the war officially ends, on August 30th, 1945, MacArthur lands at Atsugi Air Base in Japan. This had been a center for kind of kamikaze training. And so it's probably not the safest place in the world. And again, the war is not over at this point. The surrender is not actually going to be signed until September 2nd. So we've got a few days until the official end. He arrives in Japan early on purpose, and he arrives with minimal bodyguard. And then he's driven about 20 miles to Yokohama in a car that keeps breaking down. The road that he's traveling down is lined with armed Japanese soldiers. Nothing happens. No one takes a shot at him. Nobody does, anything kind of towards him. His arrival is not a secret, so it's not like he tries to land there and, just kind of get to Yokohama. And everybody knows he's coming. He makes sure that what's left of the Japanese press corps is there to cover it. He wants everyone in Japan to know that he has arrived in Japan before the war has ended. He has literally rode in a car through hundreds, tens of thousands of armed Japanese troops. He has presented himself as a massive target, and nothing has happened. He assures his staff on the drive to Yokohama that the Japanese are very disciplined, that he understands them, that if the emperor has said this war is over, if they have been ordered not to take a pot shot at MacArthur driving by, not going to do that, and that he trusts the Japanese, he trusts his understanding of their culture, and that it's absolutely safe for him to walk about Japan at this point before the war is over. I think this impression, while it was very risky, while I don't think it was something the White House was particularly excited about, it's a very powerful the Japanese. His fearlessness makes him seem untouchable, and perhaps he is invincible. It also drives the Allied victory further home, I think, for the defeated Japanese people. But it also speaks to something else. I think the Japanese people, when they read about this and they see images of this, I think they realize he respects them, that he has a deep understanding of their culture, of discipline, of honor. And I think that's an important way that he starts off the occupation. Had he been killed, had something gone wrong August 30th, I don't believe the war would have ended the way it did on September 2nd. Winston Churchill, when he hears about what MacArthur's done here and arriving early, he says that it is one of the greatest acts of the war. And so, it was a very interesting moment, but this is MacArthur presenting himself to Japanese people in a way that almost makes him seem absolutely untouchable. And how does he convince them that he is all powerful? Well, he's going to do a very good job at the surrender ceremony and the staging of it. If you are someone in Japan and you are reading about this after the fact, later you see footage of this ceremony, you have no idea that there is a President Truman. You have no idea that there is a George Marshall, that there are Joint Chiefs, that there is anybody in charge of MacArthur. I mean, he is kind of front and center at this ceremony. And combined with that landing at Atsugi, it gives the Japanese the impression that he is kind of all powerful, that his word is going to be law in Japan and he answers to no one. Now, is he on his own in Japan? Absolutely not. He is obviously, he's under the authority of the army. He's under the authority of the Joint Chiefs. He's under the authority of President Truman. And there's also an allied council that's supposed to be part of this occupation, in which the different allied governments will kind of have oversight over what's happening in the occupation. Now, he's never going to wriggle out from under the authority of the United States, of the president, but he will kind of wriggle free from that allied commission during the occupation. He's going to do that pretty quickly. But for the most part, the Japanese have the impression that kind of the buck stops with MacArthur, when in reality, he is still obviously working for the United States and for the president. But he very intentionally kind of presents himself to the Japanese as this unquestioned authority in Japan. And I think his personality and leadership style are perfectly suited to kind of reinforce that idea. And legitimacy. So he wanted to prove that he was invincible, that he was all powerful. Now he's got to prove that he is a legitimate leader of Japan. And that's a little bit harder one to accomplish. Now, early on in the occupation, he sent a message saying that he can do what he wants with the emperor. He is told that basically, if the emperor is to be tried for crime, that's fine. If not, what are you going to do with him? He is not in charge of this country. You are. So he has a lot of latitude in how he's going to deal with the emperor. Now, from the start of the war, he always believed that the emperor would be a key part of legitimizing any occupation. In the person of Emperor Hirohito, you have the religious, political, and military leader of Japan in one person. He knows that the Japanese people are waiting anxiously to see what will happen with the emperor's status, and he knows that they're very anxious for signs of what this occupation is going to be like. And as a master of theater, he knows that a properly staged meeting with the emperor could answer these questions and give the occupation the legitimacy it needs to be successful. So, at the same time, he can't be desperate in trying to arrange a meeting with the emperor. And he can't yield the high ground. He can't go to the emperor if he is to establish his legitimacy as kind of the power in Japan at this point. So he plays the waiting game. He does nothing. And he basically waits for Emperor Hirohito to make the overture to meet with him. Hirohito eventually sends MacArthur a message requesting a meeting, and MacArthur leaks that message. So people all over Japan, people all over the world know that Emperor Hirohito has asked to meet with MacArthur and has actually volunteered to come to him. And this is something pretty revolutionary because an emperor doesn't go see other people. People go see an emperor. And then MacArthur, he responds to Hirohito. He has his response leaked as well. And he tells the emperor, don't come to my military headquarters. We'll have the World Press Corps will be there. You would have to kind of, Hirohito's 5'5", I think, and MacArthur's honor guard, a bunch of guys over 6 feet tall. He's telling the emperor, you don't have to come and do this walk of shame, through these 6 foot tall honor guards to my military headquarters. Instead, why don't you come to my private residence? There's no need for this public show of humiliation. Come meet with me personally at my home. So basically, Hirohito will come to MacArthur's house. They'll meet, they'll talk, they'll take this famous picture. It's then disseminated throughout Japan in the days and weeks that follow. And you can't get better propaganda than this whole show that MacArthur's put on, from the letting people know about the request to meet to this final photo. A lot of scholars believe that this photo sanctions and legitimizes the entire occupation. It establishes the emperor as a cooperating part of occupation, and it also establishes that MacArthur is the one in charge. He kind of dominates this photograph with the assent of the emperor. After this meeting takes place, MacArthur will decide it's going to be a soft occupation. The occupation of Japan is not a full military occupation. The United States, for the most part, is going to use the Japanese government, or what survives of it, to run the for the entire period. To do this, obviously, since the legitimacy of the occupation is based on Emperor Hirohito, MacArthur's going to have to protect Hirohito from the war crimes trials, and that is very controversial today. I personally think that MacArthur is one of the main acts of the modern myth that Hirohito was not involved in any of the decisions during the war, that he was kind of pushed into rubber stamping things that the really big bad militarists were doing, and that, you know, for most of the war he's this harmless guy. He's a biologist looking at specimens under his microscope, and again, scholar and a gentleman, not a war criminal. Again, that's very controversial, but MacArthur has established Hirohito as kind of the reason for the occupation's legitimacy, and he can't undercut himself at that point. And so Hirohito and pretty much the imperial family will be not part of any war crimes trials because of that. Now, during the occupation, you know, MacArthur is going to play a very interesting character. The Emperor of Japan was always kind of considered a very remote, respected, and obeyed figure, and MacArthur kind of shifts into that mode. He does his best not to overexpose himself. You are not going to see him throwing out pitches at baseball games when baseball resumes in Japan. You're not going to see him go to social events. In fact, the only time the Japanese see him is when they crowd around his office in the Daiichi building in Tokyo, and he leaves twice a day, he arrives twice a day, and they can see him coming to work and then going home, and coming to work and going home. He is very kind of remote. He is ever present, but really kind of unseen by most people. I think by being removed in this way, he gives the Japanese kind of spiritual and psychological space to kind of accept the occupation. There is, you know, no quest for vengeance against the Japanese people. That's going to be saved for the war criminals, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But he's ever present. He's all powerful. You know, he seems to touch every aspect of Japanese life, but he's not in your face, and he doesn't really seem human. You know, he's not going about his business like everybody else in the occupation. One of the things he does early on is he says that American occupation forces need to associate with the Japanese. You know, they need to spend their money in at Japanese, you know, places to eat, at markets. They need to kind of get to know the Japanese people as human beings. They need to socialize. He does not do that himself. Again, he's very kind of removed from everything that's happening. Now, how well does the beginning of the occupation go? Pretty well. A Japanese journalist, Kazuyoshi Yamazuki, writes an autobiography of MacArthur at the start of the occupation that describes MacArthur as a living god and the reincarnation of the first Japanese emperor who had returned to Japan to restore the country to the community of nations. This is about 7 months into the occupation, and you have censorship in place. You know, MacArthur's headquarters is really big into censorship, but they don't censor this book. And about 800,000 copies of this book are sold in the first year of the occupation. Now, we can laugh and think this is really kind of foolish, and you know, there is nothing in this biography that is very accurate about MacArthur, but you can't buy propaganda like this, and there is nothing more valuable than propaganda that the people you are trying to influence begin writing for themselves about you, promoting you and your values and your legitimacy. So I mean, this is, I think, an example of kind of how well the beginning of this occupation goes. Now, does MacArthur think he is the reincarnation of a Japanese emperor? No. Does he really want the Japanese people thinking this? No, I think he thought it was kind of silly, but he's also willing to accept and play whatever role he needs to play to get them to kind of buy into this occupation and to tamp down on any social unrest or insurgency that might happen in this country, especially in this first year of occupation when things are a little unsure. Also, in this first couple months of this occupation, there's going to be issues of famine and issues of medical supply shortages. The United States and the Allies at the start of this occupation are absolutely determined that Japan not receive any money to rebuild. MacArthur, when he sees this huge humanitarian crisis happening, sees an opportunity to win hearts and minds in Japan. And he's going to bring food stores into Japan. He's going to bring medical supplies into the country. And it's going to save millions and millions of Japanese lives. And this is going to obviously kind of endear him to the Japanese people. But it's also, you know, if you cut an occupation off on humanitarian grounds, primarily, not a bad start. And so that's also what's happening. Now, we also need to recognize that there was significant Japanese agency and cooperation in the occupation. And most scholars refer to this as the bamboo strategy, this idea that bamboo can bend, you know, with the wind, with the weather, but not break. And I think what's really interesting about MacArthur's approach to Japan is that he has no intention of breaking Japan. He wants to break Japanese militarism, but he sees nothing fundamentally wrong with Japan or the Japanese people. And he makes it very clear to the Japanese that the issue is militarism, and that some things are going to have to change to eliminate that. And that change will be very swift. It's going to be jarring, but Japan is not going to be wiped clean. It's not going to be a blank slate. And I think this encourages the Japanese to be very pragmatic about the occupation, to kind of bend in those winds of change, knowing that no matter what changes come, for the most part, they will remain a people with kind of heritage. You know, they are not going to not be Japanese anymore. They are not going to be remade into Americans, or, you know, anything like that. They are going to stay a people as they have always been, minus a few things perhaps are not quite positive. I think the thoroughness of Japan's defeat in World War II allows for this. But I also think that MacArthur's early policies, because they are relatively benevolent, because they are reasonable, there isn't really a need to resist them. And once Emperor Hirohito is on board with this occupation, there isn't a lot of resistance to this early part of the occupation. Now, another important thing about the occupation is the role of the Soviets. As you all know, the Soviets enter this war against Japan very late in the war. It's not something that MacArthur was particularly thrilled about, but he never liked communists at all, so that certainly wasn't going to change during this war. MacArthur is not a fan of how Germany is split up in terms of the occupation after World War II, and he's not a fan of how Korea is split up into these kind of occupation zones where you have Western powers versus kind of the Soviets. He wants to prevent something like that from happening in Japan. Technically it is an Allied occupation. There are Commonwealth troops that are used throughout Japan. But for the most part, it's an American occupation of Japan. But he is absolutely adamant that he wants no Soviet troops in Japan part of this occupation, and that he refuses to have, you know, Hokkaido or different parts of Japan be Soviet territories in this occupation. In this picture, you see MacArthur with Lieutenant General Kuzma Derevyanko. He is a Soviet representative to MacArthur's headquarters during this occupation. And he is going to bear the brunt of MacArthur's rejection of the Soviets. He will show up for appointments at MacArthur's headquarters, and MacArthur will essentially ghost him. He'll be told that he has the wrong date for the appointment, the wrong time. Later on, he's arrested for reckless driving in Tokyo, and, you know, as this lieutenant general and this high-ranking occupation official, he goes to MacArthur's headquarters. He demands an apology. He wants the Japanese police officers to leave him alone, and MacArthur rebukes him quite publicly, and he tells him he has to respect the laws in Japan. He has to respect the authority of the Japanese policemen. At one point, Derevyanko tells MacArthur that the Soviets are going to put a division on Hokkaido, and MacArthur says, well, that's fine. If you do that, I'm going to throw you in jail. And that's kind of the end of that. And the interesting thing is that we always think about the Truman-MacArthur controversy. This is an area where Truman and MacArthur are pretty much on the same page. And MacArthur does a good job convincing Washington that by keeping Emperor Hirohito and the imperial family in place, the United States will kind of avoid creating a cultural vacuum in Japan that the Soviets could fill. And so as the Cold War is ramping up, he and Truman are determined that Japan is a place where the Soviets can easily be countered and kept out. Deripaska is actually recalled to Moscow during the occupation when it's very clear that he's not going to have much say in the occupation. He eventually returns, and apparently when he returns, MacArthur says to him, "I never thought I'd see you again. I was sure once Stalin got you back to Moscow, he'd chop off your head." And so I think MacArthur was very kind of fond of Deripaska, but that's not going to get in the way of his job in terms of keeping the Soviets out. And Stalin will later say that Deripaska was nothing but a piece of furniture to MacArthur. Bottom line, there is no political tension like what you see in Germany or in Korea, in Japan, because basically Japan will be one unified country throughout this occupation. And MacArthur has quite a bit to do with that. Now, going into Japan, there are 4 major goals, and these are to be carried out pretty quickly. MacArthur is to demilitarize Japan, to re-democratize Japan. He's to reshape Japanese national identity in a way that kind of eliminates militarism, and he's to rebuild the Japanese economy. And he's to do this with no Marshall Plan. Scholars sometimes will say, well, it's kind of racist that there was no Marshall Plan for Japan, but maybe some politicians felt that way in the mid 1940s, but really, this is something that MacArthur thought would be best for Japan. Aside from that early humanitarian intervention into Japan, MacArthur was someone who was always anxious that allies be strong and that allies be independent. And I think he thinks that, if Japan can rebuild itself, they'll be stronger as an ally for doing that, and they'll have the pride of having kind of restored their own nation mostly on their own. In terms of demilitarizing the country, this is probably the most pressing goal from the start. And this is going to start immediately with the collection and destruction of military equipment all over Japan. In the first couple months of the occupation, they are seizing 1.3 million rifles, 1.2 million tons of ammunition, and they're destroying over 190,000 coastal and field artillery guns. People have asked in the past, what do we do about Japan's merchant and naval fleet? I think the United States Navy pretty much took care of all of that during the war in the Pacific. So he doesn't have to worry too much about their shipping and their navy. But in terms of the kind of military equipment on land, that is stuff that is being destroyed very early in the occupation. They're also repatriating Japanese soldiers from all the different areas where this fought. Over 9 months, starting in October 1945, 4 million Japanese servicemen are repatriated back to Japan. The Soviet Union has about 1 million Japanese prisoners, and they refuse to send them back during this occupation. I think eventually they'll send back maybe about half of them, but for the most part, there are a lot of prisoners of war from Japan in Soviet hands that will not ever return to Japan. And it is, when you think about the destruction in Japan, when you think of the humanitarian crisis going on there, and then you throw in 4 million, mostly young men who don't have jobs, no hope of getting a job initially, it is an incredible task to reintegrate them safely back into society. This is where your insurgency could come from. But I think the occupation handles this very well. The emperor obviously lending legitimacy to the occupation helps, but education reform is also going to play a key role. And that's going to be part of Japan's demilitarization. They are going to begin kind of encouraging Japanese citizens and Japanese students that Japan is not racially superior to other countries, that Japan does not have a right to war or a right to empire. There are going to be purges of teachers that refuse to teach this new material, purges of bureaucrats who were very important in terms of the war effort, purges of politicians, of military leaders. Anybody who had a hand in shaping Japan's kind of militaristic identity is going to be purged from the government, and they're going to be replaced with others. Now, the criticism is that many of these people who replace the militarists are militarists. They just don't say it out loud. And so that is probably the case. But the point is, the most vocal militarists are purged from all areas of Japanese societies. MacArthur also lets out dissenters, so socialists, communists, people who had been arrested by the Japanese government in the war years, people who were not militarists but had other kind of radical ideas. MacArthur lets these people out of prisons because not necessarily because he wants to antagonize the more conservative elements of Japanese society, but he wants to create kind of a marketplace of ideas, of alternatives to militarism, of a little bit of diversity to kind of counter what he thought had gone wrong in Japan. He's also going to obviously participate in the war crimes trials. The Allies really, really want Japan to pay for World War II. Again, it was a brutal war, and they want to see someone punished. Especially if you're a prisoner of war and you were somewhere in the Pacific, you probably witnessed a number of war crimes, and people, most of the Allies, want to see someone pay for these crimes. MacArthur sees these war crimes trials as a part of the re-education of Japan and kind of a reshaping of Japanese identity. He sees no need to visit vengeance on your ordinary rank and file Japanese citizens, but examples have to be made, and the easiest way to do that is to target certain leaders. There are going to be war crimes trials in Manila, in Singapore, Yokohama, Morotai, in what's now Indonesia, Tokyo, and thousands of Japanese servicemen are going to be accused of war crimes and atrocities, and hundreds of them will be executed for these crimes. Now, the most controversial trials are probably the one in Manila, especially the trials of General Homa and General Yamashita, who you see pictured on the left here. These are generals that kind of caused some problems for MacArthur during the war, and many observers of these trials felt that MacArthur was probably putting his hand on the scale in a way that wasn't entirely legal, and that there's something personal about it, and that these men did not get fair trials. Aspects of both trials go to the Supreme Court of the United States. It's a relatively liberal court at the time, but it sides with MacArthur, and President Truman backs up what MacArthur's doing there in that trial. And so very likely, I think most scholars today believe that there were serious issues with the trials of Homa and Yamashita, that there was kind of an obstruction of justice. But at the time, in mid-1940s, everybody kind of just lets this happen. Someone has to be punished, and these are the guys that are there. The biggest trial, though, will be in Tokyo, and this is going to be before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. And this is where Tojo, who you see on the right, is going to come into play. He's going to be charged with crimes against the peace, crimes in terms of waging an aggressive war, and 7 members that are charged with all of this, including Tojo, will be executed in 1948 after being convicted of the crimes that they're charged. And so this is going to be an essential way to kind of reshape how the Japanese see themselves on the world stage. And it's kind of an education in terms of what is permissible and what is not in this post-war period. Another way that MacArthur and his headquarters are going to try to reshape Japanese identity comes in the way of kind of Japanese arts and culture. You've heard of the Monuments Men in Europe, and they were in Japan as well, just kind of doing a little bit of a different type of job. In Japan, their main role is censorship, and they go through museums, go through religious sites, and they make sure that the content in these museums lines up with what the occupation is meant to accomplish, kind of a removal of militarism, anything that's glorifying militarism, kamikazes, of things like that. This type of content is removed from the arts and culture space in Japan as a way to kind of educate people. The Monuments Men are also going to help Japanese cultural institutions and artists get, I think, what we would consider grants today to kind of stay afloat, to share kind of the positive sides of Japanese culture as approved by MacArthur's occupation. And this is going to be pretty successful in helping to share high levels of Japanese culture with different people around the world. I think today we know very clearly that museums and cultural institutions have powerful voices. We are very trusted as a rule by the general public. I think MacArthur understands that is the same case in Japan, and he is always interested in exercising soft power when given the opportunity to do so. And so he is going to really put a lot of energy into the reshaping of Japanese culture through the arts and culture and through the museums. And he and his wife will also be great patrons of kind of Japanese art and artists. All right, so some of the more complicated ideas in the occupation are this idea of redemocratizing Japan. And I say redemocratize because technically in about the mid 1800s, Japan had a constitution. It had kind of a system that was kind of a mix of a Prussian system and a British parliamentary system. So you had half absolute monarchy, half parliamentary system. And it had a constitution. So technically, when MacArthur goes into Japan, he is not democratizing them. He's basically trying to kind of get Japan back to a pre-war state and maybe make some updates to their constitution. In 1945, when the war ends, the average person's rights in Japan were pretty limited. Only landowners and the very wealthy could vote or own property. Women didn't have the right to vote. Ownership of industry and land was pretty much controlled by a few dozen zaibatsus, or basically families who controlled access to production, banking, and labor, so massive monopolies. And this effectively put control of the country into the hands of very, very few people. Minorities have very few rights in Japan, 1945, and there's no freedom of the press or freedom of speech. MacArthur feels that something dramatic has to be done to basically set a new course for Japan, and he's determined to kind of re-democratize Japan to do this. First is the Japanese government to come up with a new constitution, and he's not asking for minor little changes to the existing constitution. He's asking for major changes. The Japanese kind of delay a little bit. They're kind of, and when they do make certain changes and recommendations for a constitution, it's not enough for him. And so MacArthur's going to step in. The new constitution for Japan will be mainly written by people in MacArthur's headquarters based off a list he wants to see in it. Obviously, there will be Japanese cooperation and agency in this process, but for the most part, his fingerprints are pretty much all over it. His inspiration is going to come from the Bill of Rights, from the American Constitution, from British Parliament and constitutional law. It's going to come from the Swiss Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the League of Nations, and even the New Deal. And if you know anything about MacArthur, you know he hated the New Deal. He thought the New Deal was, the end of the world. But he's very pragmatic, and if this can help Japan in this particular situation, it is an inspiration for what he wants to do here. This new constitution is about 5,000 words long. It goes into effect in May of 1947, and it guarantees a kind of a parliamentary system of government and certain fundamental rights for people, no matter if they're a minority, no matter if they're women. Across the board, we see kind of universal fundamental rights in this constitution. The new constitution will end feudalism, and we'll talk a little bit about land reform in a minute. Again, universal suffrage, so women get the right to vote, minorities Women get the right to run for office, which is something that had not been in place before. Freedom of speech, of the press, for all races, education for all. This is kind of significant and probably part of the re-education strategy. The right of workers to organize and strike, unless MacArthur doesn't want you to do that during the occupation. The development of political parties. MacArthur doesn't mind if the Japanese have, parties that represent socialism or communism or not. He wants to make sure that they're organically Japanese political parties, not Soviet-sponsored parties. Also, the Constitution basically revises where sovereignty lies in the Japanese system. From this point on, when this Constitution is approved, sovereignty rests in the Japanese people, no longer in the person of the emperor. And that's kind of a major, major change for Japan. The most important part of the Constitution for MacArthur is something called Article 9. And again, I think you see his fingerprints most strongly on this particular one. This is the article in which Japan renounces war as an instrument of settling kind of disputes or anything. It basically says Japan is not going to go to war again. We don't recognize this as a right of our nation, any longer. MacArthur sees this as his greatest achievement in the occupation, and he sees it as a massive victory in terms of winning that peace. This is something he sees as a just reward for the sacrifice made in the Pacific. The other thing that he's going to be very proud of is women's suffrage and the emancipation of women in Japan. Very early on in the occupation, he informs the Japanese government that this is non-negotiable, that he understands that there are very conservative elements that don't want to see women kind of enfranchised, but that's going to be too bad. This is going to be one of those things that is going to come whether they want it or not. His approach towards this is kind of interesting, though. It's half very pragmatic and then half he's a 19th century Victorian living, in the 20th century. He has this idea that women are only ones that can bring decency and better judgment to politics. And scholars today would kind of reject that as a blanket characterization of women that's not entirely accurate. But whatever his personal reasons for doing this, he's absolutely committed to women and their emancipation in Japan. This includes marriage rights. To this point, if you were a woman in Japan, you could be married off to someone whether you wanted to be married to them or not. Under this occupation government, women get the right to kind of refuse marriages that they do not want to be a part of. So you can no longer be forced into marrying anyone. And this is all about, I think, picking apart the power of the elite. Mostly these elite men who had kind of underpinned a very kind of chauvinistic, militaristic man. And MacArthur's determined to kind of break. This is one of the areas where he will try to kind of break that power. Now, Japanese women will go to the polls during the occupation, will turn up to vote, and MacArthur is thrilled about this. There was a big propaganda campaign from his headquarters to kind of let women know you've got this right now, it's safe for you, you can go to the polls. A lot of political scientists, a lot of anthropologists had said they won't. Japan is such a traditional society, you're not going to see a turnout. Japan's not ready for this. That is completely wrong. And in the first couple of elections, MacArthur is absolutely thrilled to see women going to the polls, and he's thrilled to see women being elected to the legislature. It is a major, major step for Japan, and MacArthur doesn't leave it there. The first election, when women are actually elected, he meets with them. It's a very public meeting. He wants to show his support for them. He wants to show the world that they are not token members of the legislature. He plans to back them. But I do think it's interesting that he also warns them not to form a voting bloc. Don't become just a block of women in your own party with your own causes. He tells them you've got to meet the men on the floor in complete equality. He wants them to be equal partners in this legislature, not a voting bloc just for women. Moving on to land reform. So the Constitution basically gets rid of things like feudalism. And in pre-war Japan, about 2/3 of agricultural land was rented. It wasn't owned by the people farming it. Farmers made up about 50% of the workforce in Japan, and they typically paid a little over 50% of their crops in rent. And the average farm size in Japan was about 1 acre. So if you know anything about land or farming, 1 acre is not a whole lot when you owe half your crops to someone else. And so a lot of the farmers in Japan live kind of at a poverty level. Now, occupation era land reform is going to take land away from the landlords and it's going to redistribute it to farmers. So if you're a landlord, you're going to be locked into only being allowed to own X amount of land. Anything over that is going to be sold at a very reasonable rate that these poor farmers can afford. Does this sound like socialism? Does this sound like redistribution of wealth? Yes, it does. These are things that MacArthur railed against in the United States, but here in Japan, he sees it as a pragmatic solution to a problem of the lack of generational wealth. Arthur's idea is that if the farmers can become more economically independent, they can rise to form a middle class, and then they can participate more freely in democracy. And then, as they build this generational wealth, we end up with a bulwark against kind of the elites, the people that drew Japan into war last time. He basically wants a middle class, a very, very strong middle class in Japan, and he sees this as a way of kind of doing that. Now, again, does he want to see this in the United States? No. Does he think that Roosevelt and the New Deal were the beginnings of kind of the Antichrist? Yes, sort of. But for the most part, if it works in Japan, he's willing to try it. Again, he's got hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers being repatriated. They need jobs. They need something to put them to work. This is a solution for that problem. Now let's talk about the zaibatsus, these kind of great Japanese business monopolies owned by a very, very small group, very small families. These zaibatsus controlled Japanese industry and economy, and MacArthur and Dwight D. Eisenhower are always, even in like the 1930s and 40s, talking about something called the military-industrial complex, and this is that in Japan to the nth degree. Initial occupation policy is to turn Japan into kind of an agrarian powerhouse, break up the giant corporations that led Japan into war, and kind of grow a smaller Japanese industry. By 1947, MacArthur's really moving forward with this. They're seizing the holdings of these companies, they're breaking up monopolies, and then reverse course. Suddenly, we have a major reversal of the policy of breaking because the Cold War tensions are rising. You have the costs of the occupations in Europe and in Japan kind of looking enormous and making the United States government a little worried about budget. And then all of that is going to lead to a reassessment of the policy of breaking up these Japanese monopolies and an idea that to be a bulwark against communism, Japan needs to be an industrial powerhouse, not an agrarian one. And so MacArthur will be told in the middle of the occupation to basically reverse course. Lots of the Japanese people in the government are thrilled with this. Japanese politicians and the elites that are left don't really want to see Japan weak. They don't want to see the zaibatsus totally gone. And so that is the reason why today we have a lot of these companies and a lot of the descendants of these zaibatsus today forming kind of the industrial and the economic backbone of Japan. So a lot of these companies you see to the right, they're descendants or parts of those zaibatsus. They survive because of reverse course. Now, in the end, though, Japan's post-war economic recovery is mostly assured by the Korean War, not really by any of the occupation policies like reverse course. I think a good analogy for this is the Great Depression. The Great Depression lasts a very, very long time. There are a lot of policies put in place to ease it, to end it. What really ends it in the end is World War II. And so in the case of Japan, Japan's economy comes back because of the Korean War. From 1950, when the war starts, to 1953, Japan becomes America's industrial supply depot. It becomes a major base for forces in that region. And then later on in the future, in Vietnam, it will kind of again serve that role. So the wars that America has fought in Asia have really relied on Japanese industrial power. In the case of Korea, though, what's really interesting is that when the Korean War starts, Japan is only 5 years into this occupation, 5 years removed from the devastation of August 1945. And yet you have this incredible economic and industrial transformation. It's incredible what happens there. MacArthur will serve as commander of UN forces in Korea while he is still in charge of the occupation of Japan. He is 70 years old at this point. Most people don't remember or know that he had actually retired prior to World War II and then was recalled to active duty right before the war started. So technically, this is a guy who's been in the Army at this point over 50 years. Most people wonder why he wasn't maybe retired at this point, and why you're giving this man not only the major job of Japan, but also Korea. And I think the answer to that is that Korea is the United Nations' first military action. You need a big name to sit on top of that military alliance. He's in the region, everybody knows him, and so he'll be put in charge of that job as well. He will be removed from command in April of 1951 by President Truman. This is also going to include his role in administering the occupation of Japan. And he will return to the United States at that point for the first time in over a decade. That's how, he'd been out of the States since the late 1930s. Now, when he's removed, you have, he leaves Tokyo, he flies back to the United States. Route he takes to the airport, you have Japanese people lining every single block. Millions of people turn out to see him leave the country. And it's kind of a difficult moment for a lot of the Japanese. They've gotten used to them. They've gotten used to him. They kind of like him in some ways. And there's concern about what is going to happen in Japan now that he's gone. Also, a side note, he had a lot of support for his presidential ambitions in Japan, probably more than he had in the United States. So I always think that's a little interesting. These fears on the part of the Japanese people are unnecessary. By 1951, when he's fired and he returns home, the occupation is basically over. The formal peace treaty between the Allies and Japan is signed in September 1951, about 5 months after MacArthur's firing. And MacArthur, he doesn't have a role in it anymore, and so he's not part of the signing ceremony in San Francisco. And this is something that the Japanese representatives see as kind of a glaring omission, but for American officials, and certainly for President Truman, MacArthur's presence at this after he's been fired is certainly not. A year after his removal, the occupation ends, but he had already, I think, established the framework for a very close U.S.-Japan bilateral alliance, and this is something that continues today. I would argue that the occupation of Japan is probably the most successful occupation in all of history, especially against the backdrop of what's happening in Asia in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. When you look at Asia in that post-World War II period, you see most of the Allies being unwilling to give up their colonial possessions. You see the British, the French, the Dutch groups, wanting to hold on to their pre-war territories. And then you see groups in these territories resorting to civil unrest and to violence and war to seek their own independence. In contrast, what you see in terms of US-led territories is a different story. In the Philippines, 1946, they get independence. MacArthur had always been a huge proponent of that. And then you see the occupation of Japan being led by MacArthur, who is a committed anti-colonialist with no idea of having Japan for America forever. And so I think this is very significant. Missteps are coming in terms of foreign policy in Asia, but initial American policy as it's set up in this occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1950, it's set up pretty well. And MacArthur is a very, very major part of that. To close, I want to talk a little bit about the Japanese perspective of the occupation. After the tsunami that devastated Japan in 2011, I think, Japanese media agencies reached out to the MacArthur Memorial to get rights to this particular image of MacArthur getting out of his plane at Atsugi right at the start of the occupation. They wanted to print this in Japanese newspapers around the country in the wake of the tsunami disaster. And the message was one of have hope. We have survived difficult things in the past. We will endure. We will rebuild. And I think it's just really, really significant that MacArthur's arrival in 1945 at the start of this occupation in 2011 was still seen as not a moment of absolute defeat for Japan, but as a reminder that prosperity would return, that Japan is never destroyed. And to have MacArthur be the image of that is really, I think, pretty incredible and a great testament to probably his greatest legacy to our country. Now, in close, we'll talk a little bit about MacArthur again. He's often referred to as the American Caesar, and this is why. Like Caesar, he could be a great battlefield commander in times of war. Dugout Doug is the World War II equivalent of fake news. Like Caesar, he could also be a master propagandist. And it's easy, again, to despise the drama and the ego. And certainly at different points in his career, his actions certainly make him look a little foolish, but at other times, his mastery of information operations and theater really pay huge dividends for his country. And finally, like Julius Caesar, MacArthur could be a great civil administrator. And that is kind of the legacy of the Japan-US relationship today. That occupation could have gone very badly. Instead, it is a very successful one, and it sets the stage for US-Japan relations for decades to come. Every time there's a new ambassador being sent to Japan, every time there's a new ambassador being sent from Washington, they want to come here, they come to the memorial, and they want to know about MacArthur and Japan. Now, the occupation of Japan wins the peace, and I think it's a peace that honors the sacrifice of American servicemen in the Pacific, and I would argue that the Japanese-US relationship today honors the dead on both sides in that war, and that is something very significant and something that MacArthur was a big part of. So thank you very much. Again, pleasure to be here. And if there's questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, man. It's absolutely fascinating. Great talk and a subject that we really should be more familiar with as Americans. I agree that the occupation of Japan and in a different way, the occupation of Germany after World War II were just textbook examples of ending a war that will be studied generations from now. No better evidence of that, the extent to which both Germany and Japan are now close allies. I don't think many people could really imagine a war between the United States and Japan anymore. That's the way it had happened way back when. Let me ask a question related to that. Are you aware that MacArthur received criticism at the time, maybe from congressional leaders, that he was being too lenient, like, to the Japanese?
Yeah, there was considerable debate among different legislators and in Congress about MacArthur being too soft on the Japanese, especially in terms of protecting the Japanese emperor. There were a lot of people that wanted to see Hirohito tried and executed for war crimes. And MacArthur, I think, makes himself a little popular on both sides of the aisle by kind of sticking to that decision to protect the emperor. I think other people wanted to see the occupation itself harder on individual Japanese. Again, I think it's probably fortunate that MacArthur didn't go in that direction, but there were definitely other commanders in the Pacific Theater that might have been up for that same occupation job that had pretty much let people know through the press that they hope to have a very vengeful occupation. And I think it's fortunate that MacArthur's more pragmatic approach was the one that President Truman ended up going with.
Excellent. Another question, a little bit off the subject. How did the MacArthur Memorial end up in a naval city like Norfolk?
Great question. Well, basically, MacArthur's mother is a Norfolk native. And if you know anything about MacArthur, he was very, very close to his mother. She was probably his biggest fan. He loved her very, very much. And so this was her hometown. And so when he gets fired by Truman, he comes back to the States. He comes back to Norfolk briefly to dedicate a park in the city in her honor. And the city leaders realize he really loves his mother, wants to honor her memory. And so they pretty much come up over the next few years with an idea of offering him a really wonderful building in downtown Norfolk to be his museum. And essentially they turn it into what is a presidential library for someone who was never president of the United States. So that's why he's here. They also kind of tell him that, once MacArthur's here, people all over the world will think of this region as the final resting place of General MacArthur, not a Navy town. That is not true. That never happened, but it kind of helps get him here.
Excellent. One of my favorite stories from his early years was MacArthur got his appointment to West Point, and his mother went with him. I don't think that happens very often, but
not too often. But you know what? Maybe that's why he was so interested in women's suffrage in Japan. He had a strong, powerful, nobody get in my way mama. And maybe that gave him a lot of respect for women in other parts of the world.
MacArthur and his wife are buried at the memorial. Where is Mom buried?
His mom is buried up at Arlington with his father. His father retired from the Army as a highly decorated lieutenant general. And so they're both buried together in Arlington.
Excellent. Well, I believe that's all the questions we have. We want to thank you, Amanda, and we thank all the people tuned in now, and then many more people watch these after the fact on their own time. So we thank you for joining in as well. If you do come up with some questions after the fact, feel free to email them to us, education@dday.org, or send them to Amanda at the MacArthur Memorial. We are both in the business of preserving history and paying tribute to the greatest generation. So we'll be happy to answer any questions and help to dispense knowledge. So thank you, Amanda. Hope things continue to go well there in Norfolk, and hope we will see you in person soon.
I hope so too. You guys take care.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us.